Collinsville, Illinois, October 2014. Dr. Kristen Hedman sets down the 338th tooth. She already knows what it's going to show. One more non-local strontium ratio. One more person who did not grow up here. One more body buried in a city they walked to, from somewhere hundreds of miles away, and never left. 1 in 3. That's what her data says. 1 in every 3 people buried in the largest city in pre-Columbian North America was an immigrant. Now hold that number, and hold this one. In the year 1100 CE, this city, sitting on the Mississippi River floodplain just east of what is now St. Louis, held more people than London. Not a village, not a ceremonial site, a city, larger than any settlement that would exist north of Mexico for the next 700 years. No American city would surpass its population until after the Revolution, and we barely teach it. Strontium isotope analysis works like this. Your tooth enamel crystallizes during childhood and locks in the chemical signature of the water and soil you grew up on. That signature is specific to geography. When you move, the chemistry moves with you, frozen in place, readable 1,000 years later. What Hedman's team found by reading those ratios across 338 individuals was proof that Cahokia, whatever it was pulling people in from Minnesota to Mississippi. Not a few people, not an elite class of traders. 1/3 of the entire buried population. Stay with me, because this next part is the reason this video exists. Because if you want to understand where those people were going, what they were walking toward, you need to understand what happened in one small mound on Cahokia's southern edge. A mound archaeologists labeled Mound 72, where 272 people were buried in 25 separate features, where one man was laid on a bed of 20,000 shell beads in the shape of a bird, and where the bodies around him tell a story that the field spent decades getting wrong. If you've ever actually wondered about the real biological story of ancient North America, not the textbook version, the actual genomic record, subscribe. Because what comes next goes places most channels won't. A migration wave reshaped the largest city in North American history, drew people from across the continent, built pyramids larger at their base than the ones in Egypt, and left no name. The people who built Cahokia did not call it Cahokia. We don't know what they called themselves. And the genetics that could answer that has barely been done. The name Cahokia doesn't belong to the builders. It comes from a subtribe of the Illinois Confederation. People who were living near the mounds in the 1600s when French missionaries arrived. They didn't build what was there. They found ruins. The civilization that raised those pyramids left no written language, no name in any colonial record, no oral tradition that any outside observer ever documented. A city that held up to 20,000 people at its peak, anonymous for 7 centuries. That anonymity is itself a data point. But we'll get there. First, the scale. In the year 1050 CE, something happened on that Illinois floodplain that archaeologist Timothy Pocketot at the University of Illinois called with complete precision the Big Bang. Not metaphorically, structurally. Population grew 500% in a single generation, from roughly 1,000 people to somewhere between 10 and 20,000 in 30 years, possibly less. That cannot happen from birth rates. You cannot reproduce your way to a 500% population increase in one generation. That number requires movement. That number is people arriving. And yet, the data said the exact opposite of what you'd expect to find when you look at what they built. Monk's Mound, the central pyramid, has a larger footprint than the Great Pyramid of Giza. Think about what that means in terms of labor, in terms of directed authority. Someone told 20,000 people what to build and where to build it, and they built it. That is not communal creativity. That is a power structure sufficiently consolidated to organize what may be the largest construction project in the pre-Columbian Western Hemisphere north of Mexico. But here's the part that doesn't get said. The people whose homes occupied that ground before the Big Bang, their archaeological signatures vanish within a single stratigraphic layer. The Grand Plaza, 45 football fields of deliberately leveled earth, required the removal of the existing landscape. The people who were already there had their homes erased. One layer. Done. Every popular account of Cahokia describes it as a voluntary gathering. People drawn by religion, by trade surplus, by the promise of belonging. The archaeology allows a colder interpretation. The Big Bang may have been, for some of the people living in its path, an imposition. What was being imposed at Cahokia was not just architecture. It was a food system. Carbon isotopes in bone can tell you what someone ate. Specifically, they can distinguish between C3 plants, most wild foods, most ancient crops, and C4 plants, which includes maize, corn. Around 950 CE, something changes in the isotope signatures across the entire American bottom. The carbon shifts. Maize becomes dominant. And within one human lifetime, Cahokia explodes. Maize is not just nutrition. Maize is politics. The moment one group controls corn production at scale, every social relationship in the city reorganizes around that control. You can store maize. You can distribute it. You can withhold it. You can feed an army or starve a neighborhood. The Big Bang is inseparable from the agricultural revolution that made it possible. And agricultural revolutions always, without exception, create hierarchy. Dr. Stanley Ambrose and his colleagues at the University of Illinois spent years reading the nitrogen and carbon ratios in over 200 individuals from 14 burial locations across Cahokia, including 72 individuals from Mound 72 specifically. What they found was not subtle. High-status burials showed low maize consumption and significantly higher animal protein. The mass sacrificial victims below them showed elevated maize, low protein, and skeletal pathologies consistent with nutritional stress. Same city, same mound, completely different bodies. The people who built the pyramids were not well fed. And then there was feature 229. This is a burial grouping inside Mound 72, where the arrangement is different from everything around it. Every other feature, carefully organized, deliberate, positioned with cosmological precision. Feature 229 lower, bodies placed haphazardly, with evidence of physical trauma that predates death. Lead excavator Melvin Fowler, who spent decades on that site, described the arrangement as categorically distinct from the ritual sacrifice features. These individuals were not buried. They were deposited. There's a mitochondrial lineage in the Mound 72 sacrificial features that researchers have flagged but not yet traced. A maternal line that doesn't match the expected Mississippian patterns, appearing in the mass grave features and not yet attributed to a source community. That number stopped me cold. The source question is exactly what Philip Slater and Dr. Kristen Hedman set out to answer. The assumption, built into every interpretation of Mound 72 for decades, was that the women in the mass graves were foreign, captives from conquered communities. Tribute, proof of Cahokia's reach into distant territories. The kind of sacrificial offering that imperial powers have made across human history. You take from elsewhere, you display what you took, you demonstrate that you are powerful enough to destroy what belongs to someone else. It was a legible narrative, a familiar one, and the strontium isotopes were about to destroy it completely. Philip Slater and Dr. Hedman published their Mound 72 analysis in 2015. They ran the ratios on 109 individuals from across the burial features. And the number that came back, the number for the percentage of mass grave, victims whose strontium signatures placed them squarely within the local American bottom range, was 86%. 86% local. In every prior account of Cahokia, the sacrificed were strangers. In 2015, the isotopes said they were neighbors. Everything I just told you, Hold on to it, because it's about to mean something completely different. Because the prior interpretation wasn't just wrong about the identity of the victims. It was wrong about what kind of power Cahokia actually was. A system that can sacrifice its own people, not foreign captives, but local residents, at scale, in public, in a city built on the promise of belonging and arrival, is not a trade polity or a pilgrimage community in the way those terms are normally used. It is something that has no clean category in North American archaeology before this finding. And here's the detail that makes it stranger. Feature 214, one of the Mound 72 burial groupings, showed 36% non-local strontium signatures, significantly higher than the mass graves. The people buried with more care, more organization, more ritual attention, were more likely to be from somewhere else. The foreigners were treated better in death than the locals. The power hierarchy at Cahokia transcended origin. It didn't matter where you came from. It mattered what position you occupied in the system after you arrived. One dendrochronological anomaly is now complicating the anchor date of this entire framework. A cedar post sequence from the Woodhenge alignments, when reanalyzed, places construction at 1025 CE, a full generation before the accepted Big Bang date. Someone was planning this before the explosion happened. What came before 1050 CE is now the question the chronology is forcing. The 5 Woodhenge post circles at Cahokia, successive rings of red cedar posts increasing in diameter across multiple construction phases, function as horizon calendars. They mark the winter solstice sunrise, the summer solstice, the equinoxes. This is multi-generational institutional knowledge. You don't build a functioning astronomical calendar on your first attempt. You build it because someone taught you, and someone taught them, and the knowledge traveled across time before the city arrived. The people who created the Big Bang had been preparing for it. Dr. Kristen Hedman's team expanded their strontium isoscape work in 2018, mapping the geochemical signatures of the mid-continent from Minnesota to Mississippi to try to identify where Cahokia's immigrants actually came from. What they found was not a single source. Multiple distinct geographic regions contributing simultaneously. People from the upper Great Lakes, people from the Central Plains, people from the river systems south of the city, all arriving in the same window of time. What brings people from that many different places at once? 2 possibilities. 1, a religious event of sufficient magnitude to function as a continental signal, a founding ceremony so powerful it was heard from 500 miles away. 2, recruitment. Active, deliberate, organized recruitment by a political authority with the reach to communicate across that distance. Both possibilities point to the same conclusion. Whoever initiated the Big Bang had the power to be heard from Minnesota to Mississippi, and they used it. The Grand Feast supports this. In the founding archaeological layer, the deposits that correspond to Cahokia's initial construction phase, there is material evidence of communal cooking and food processing at a scale that exceeds any normal residential pattern. Timothy Pocketot identified this as a single event feast, not a recurring ceremony, a founding act. A ritual designed to bind newly arrived populations, people from dozens of different geographic origins, to the emerging order of a city they had just walked into and did not yet understand. The one data set that would resolve whether those arrivals were voluntary, drawn by religion, or compelled by something more is the full ancient genome sequence of Cahokia's population. And that data set does not exist. No published full genome archaeogenomics from this site. The most powerful city in pre-Columbian North America is genetically almost entirely unread. We are reading an entire civilization's power structure from isotopes and dental morphology because the genetic record is locked in bones inside an access framework that has not yet been resolved. Now, let me give you the comforting version. Because it exists, and it's not stupid, and it deserves to be taken seriously before we take it apart. The comforting version of Cahokia's end goes like this. The city outgrew itself. The forests were cleared for construction timber and agricultural expansion, centuries of deforestation that destabilized the upland soils. The droughts came. Larry Benson at the U.S. Geological Survey documented them through tree ring and speleothem records. Severe dry conditions beginning around 1100 CE, a particularly devastating drought from 1276 to 1297. The Mississippi flooded. The crops failed. The soil eroded. And rational people in an increasingly marginal city made rational decisions to leave. The population declined gradually across 150 years. Nobody forced them. They went home or somewhere new. City's end. This one ended slowly, sensibly, without drama. There are three things this interpretation explains. The gradual population decline after 1200 CE. The reduction in monumental construction. The fecal Steinol record from Horseshoe Lake. Organic molecules preserved in lake sediment that function as a direct proxy for human population density, which documents exactly the kind of slow reduction you'd expect from an orderly dispersal. The evidence fits. The model is coherent. Now here is the one data point that does not fit. Beginning around 1175 CE, while the population was still substantial, while the city was still functioning, Cahokia's central ceremonial district was enclosed by a massive wooden palisade wall, 2 miles in circumference, watchtowers at 70-foot intervals, 20,000 logs. And then it was rebuilt, and then rebuilt again, and then a fourth time. The fourth reconstruction dates to the final phase of occupation. The last people in Cahokia, whoever they were still building defensive walls. Communities planning a peaceful, rational exit do not rebuild their fortifications 4 times. The drought model doesn't explain 80,000 logs of defensive construction across the terminal decades of the city. The peaceful dispersal theory has a wall through it, literally. Who was the palisade keeping out, or keeping in? The model that says everyone left calmly cannot answer that. And the 1931 destruction of Cahokia's second largest mound, leveled by horseradish, farmers for filled dirt, later replaced by an airfield, and in the 1970s, a pornographic drive-in, tells you something about how thoroughly this city was forgotten. Something about this place resisted memory. The descendants of its dispersed population are alive. Researchers at the University of Illinois have identified Osage, Chickasaw, Quapaw, Pawnee, Mandan, Choctaw, and Ponca communities as probable inheritors of Cahokian ancestry. They carry its genetic signature. They carry what happened in Mound 72. And most of them carry it without a name for what they carry. What living communities carry from Cahokia is not only ancestry. It's a structural position, a geographic displacement layered on top of an ancient one. The Osage, among the most probable Cahokian descendants according to University of Illinois researchers, came from Missouri and Arkansas. Look at the strontium isoscape that Hedman's team built across the mid-continent. The highest concentration of immigrant origin signatures pointing toward Cahokia cluster in exactly that region. Missouri, Arkansas. The same geography that produced Cahokia's own arriving population is, 800 years later, the ancestral homeland the Osage were removed from, by federal order, in 1872, relocated to Oklahoma. The people didn't vanish. That's the point Dr. A.J. White and his team at UC Berkeley were making when they published their 2020 analysis of Horseshoe Lake sediment cores. What they found was continuous human presence in the Cahokia region through the abandonment of the city, through the 1300s, through the 1400s, through first European contact, fecal stanols, organic molecules from human digestion, preserved in lake sediment, document people living near those mounds for centuries after the city ended. The lost civilization framing is not an archaeological finding. It is a colonial assumption. The assumption of disappearance because European contact found no city, not because there were no people. This isn't just ancient history. This is in your DNA right now. Cahokia didn't die. It decentralized. The people who decentralized it maintained agricultural practices, trade networks, cosmological frameworks that linked directly back to the Mississippian period. And then they experienced a second dispersal, not ecological this time, but political. Removal. Reservation. The systematic suppression of indigenous religious practice by the Bureau of Indian Affairs in the early 20th century. The Osage Nation's sacred morning star ceremony has direct structural parallels with Mound 72's alignment to the winter solstice sunrise. The same cosmological logic, the same relationship between celestial timing and the ritual use of dedicated space appears in both. The BIA targeted that ceremony specifically for suppression. The genetic thread from Cahokia's Mound 72 to contemporary Osage ceremony came close to being severed, not by time, but by federal policy. And if the full genome of Cahokia's population were published, living communities could make legal, cultural, and historical arguments about their relationship to this site that they currently cannot make. The missing genome is not just a scientific gap, it is a political one. Actually, before we go further, I want to ask you something directly. In our last episode, we followed a population that disappeared from the historical record entirely and showed up in the DNA of people who had no idea they were carrying that lineage. Cahokia is the same problem from the other direction. We can see the city, we can read the isotopes, but the genome sequences that would confirm which living communities descend from which Cahokian populations have not been published. The science that could answer the question exists. It just hasn't been done. So tell me in the comments, do you carry Indigenous American ancestry? Do you know which nation or tribe? Because the question of who is genetically descended from Cahokia is not settled history. It is open science, right now. And your answer might be closer to the center of this story than you think. Which brings us to what happened inside the walls. The material evidence from Feature 229 was the first sign that Mound 72 contained more than one kind of death. Every other feature in that mound, carefully organized, deliberately positioned, cosmologically precise. Feature 229 lower, 40 bodies arranged without order. Skeletal trauma inconsistent with the other mass grave features. Not the clean evidence of ritual killing you find in the organized features. Something rougher, more immediate. Melvin Fowler, who spent decades excavating that site, documented these individuals as categorically distinct in their mortuary treatment from everything else in the mound. Sacrifice is a system, massacre is a rupture. Feature 229 may be both. And then Hedman's 2015 analysis added one more layer to this. Feature 214, the burial grouping with the highest rate of non-local strontium signatures, 36%, is also the most organized sacrificial feature. The foreigners were buried with more ritual attention than the locals. The people who traveled furthest to reach Cahokia were, in death, treated with more ceremonial care than the people who grew up there. The Birdman burial sits above all of this, the man on 20,000 shell beads. His isotope profile, low maize, high protein. His grave goods include copper ornaments and hundreds of unused projectile points. Objects that required trade networks, stretching 800 miles to the Gulf of Mexico. His funeral was a political statement executed in bone and shell. And somewhere in the burial features arranged around him among the local women placed there to accompany his death, the system that built